Today we are still talking about functions and domain and range because this whole unit is all about functions, domain, and range. But before we start the actual worksheet that we're doing today, I want to tie this back into something that you guys did in 7th and 8th grade to make it a little bit easier to understand why we're doing what we're going to do today. So what we have here is a function. We have an algebraic equation, y equals 3x plus 1. Then I have created a table and I have a graph. These three things should be pretty familiar from what you have done in your past math classes. So what I'm going to do is take the x value, -1, and I want to know on this function, when the x value is -1, the input, I want to know what the output is going to be. So what that means is I'm going to take this equation 3. Instead of x, I know that x is -1, and it says plus 1. So when I calculate that, 3 times -1 is -3. -3 plus 1 is the number -2. So in this function, when my input, I plugged in a -1, my output, my y, my range, is -2. So I'm going to try another x value. So when my x value is 0, I'm going to plug in a 0 where there was an x. That's an x. I want to know when x is 0, what's the y value in that function? 3 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. So when my input, my x is 0, then my output, or my y, is the number +1. One more, let's look to see when x is a +1, in this function, what will the y be? So I take this idea. I still have a 3 for my original function. I plug in a 1 for x. 3 times 1 is the number 3, plus 1 is 4. So when my x value is a 1, my y value is a 4. So I just completed a table of values. I could have picked any x numbers to see where their y's would be, but I picked the easiest 3, some negative, some positive, so that way I can graph this and see what it looks like. So I'm going to graph the first ordered pair, which is going to be left 1, down 2. So from the middle, I go left 1 and down 2. Then the next one is 0, +1, and then finally I have 1, 4. So in this function, I created 3 ordered pairs. By plugging in the input, I plugged in some x values and found some y values. I'm going to connect these because in an equation, it's continuous. So any number I could have picked for x. And so this creates a line. So this you did in hopefully 7th and 8th grade to see that we can take an equation, plug in some x values, and figure out where their y values are. We took those answers, we put it on a graph, and we see what the function looks like. This is the equation for this line. So now we're going to take that same idea and add a little bit of a high school twist to it. Makes it a little bit more exciting. So go ahead and find your notes to the top of this page, please. All right, so what we had said last time is that f of x is a fancy way of saying y equals. Don't let it scare you. It just means y equals. So we have a function, just like we did a minute ago, that says y, or f of x, equals 3x plus 2. So now, instead of making a table of values like I did a minute ago, they are telling us which x values they want, but instead they are not putting it on the table, but they are writing it in this notation. So what that means is that in this original piece here, it said f of x. But now instead of an x, it says, what is f of -2? So what that means is that in this equation, it wants to know, when I plug in x of -2, what is the y value? So let's see. It says 3. Instead of x, I'm going to plug in -2 and then plus 2. 3 times -2 is -6. -6 plus 2 is the number -4. So it's the same as what we just did a minute ago on those tables, but instead of writing it on a table, it said use this x value. If it's in parentheses, it's the x that we get to plug into the equation. It's the input that we put into the equation. So now we have an x value, -2, and we figured out when x is -2, the y is -4. And then that becomes an ordered pair, left 2, down 4. So this is an ordered pair that lives in this function. So what we need to do, if a number is in parentheses, simply plug it in for x. Very simple. So I'm still using my same equation for these next examples. So it says take 3 instead of x, x is a -3. And then it says plus 2. So I took my x value and I plugged it in for x. 3 times -3 is the number -9. -9 plus 2 is the number -7. So what that means is that on this function, when there is an x value of -3, its y value is -7. Just like putting it on a table, but instead we just wrote it like this. -3 goes with -7. Try again. So in this example, we take our original function, which started with the 3. We're replacing our x with our input. We put in a 1 and then plus 2. 3 times 1 is 3, plus 2 is 5. So that means there is an ordered pair that says when x is 1, y is 5. Next, 3. I'm going to input a -1 in my equation for x. Again, I'm just using this equation from up here and inputting my x value. 3 times -1 is -3. -3 plus 2 is -1. So when my x value is a -1, my y value is also -1. This is an ordered pair that would live in this function on this line. Next, when x is 0, so 3 comes from the equation, I'm plugging in a 0 plus 2. 3 times 0 is 0. 0 plus 2 is 2. So then that creates the ordered pair when x is 0, y is 2. So now I can graph these since all of these ordered pairs live on this line. So I'm going to start with right 1, up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When x is -1, y is -1. When x is -3, y is -7. When x is 0, y is 2. So these ordered pairs I created by plugging in the x value into this equation, and then that created a line. So it's a fancy way to make ordered pairs. Simply take your input and plug it into the equation for x. Very easy. Okay, so now we're going to do a couple more, but this time you don't need to make it an ordered pair. If it just says evaluate, that just means plug in the number for x and tell me what number comes out. So this says take your f function. So I have 3 different functions here. One whose name is f, one whose name is g, and one whose name is h. So number 1 says, hey, take your f function and plug into my input. My x value is a 3. So I'm going to write it -2. Instead of this x, I replace it with a 3. And then there's a plus 8. -2 times 3 is -6. -6 plus 8 is the number 2. So my answer is that when my x value is 3, my output, my y value, is a 2. Same thing, next one. This one says take your g function. Oh, hey, here's my g function. And it says plug in my input, take this 8, and plug it into the equation for x. So that means I have 2. 3 minus Instead of this x, I'm replacing it with my input, which is an 8. And then I solve. 3 minus 8 is negative 5. Negative 5 times 2 is a negative 10. So when my input is an 8, my x value, I plugged it in, that's 8. Then my output is the number negative 10. We always just plug it in for x. Very easy. So I have another one. It still wants the g function. This time it wants me to plug in the number negative 4. 2, open parentheses, 3 minus. Be careful. The minus sign right here comes from the equation right there. Now instead of the x, I plug in the full x, which was a negative 4. So this looks a little ugly. A minus negative turns into a plus sign. 3 plus 4 is 7. 7 times 2 is 14. Last but not least, it wants my h function. Here we go. That one says h. So I take this x value and I plug it in every single time I see an x. So it starts with a 3. Instead of x, I replace x with negative 2. That number is squared plus 2. Uh-oh, I see another x. So I plug in another negative 2. And then I have a plus 1. Then I clean this up. Negative 2 squared is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 minus 4 plus 1 gives me the number 9. So what we learned is that if there's a number in the parentheses, you simply plug it in your equation for x. So now go ahead and do that exact same thing on the next page. So you're doing the top of the bag. Super easy. If it's in parentheses, it's the input. The input is the x, and then you just solve. So try numbers 1 through 6. Okay, once you're done with 1 through 6, we're going to move on to the next piece, which is even easier than what you just did. So this time it says we need to write ordered pairs from function notation. Well, we just did this. We said that if it's in the parentheses, it's the x. If it's not the x, then it's the y. So the ordered pair is that x is 2 and y is 1. So in this one, again, if it's in parentheses, it's the x. If it's not in parentheses, it's the y. So it's just the ordered pair, negative 3, comma 5. Same pattern, 0, negative 4, 1, comma 13. It's just a fancy high school way of writing an ordered pair. It means if the number's in parentheses, it's the x value. The number on the outside is the output, which is the y value. So now we are going to evaluate function notation, which is what we just did. But this time, instead of an equation, I'm giving you a graph, which is even easier. So it says, write the x of the ordered pair that they give you. So we said if it's in parentheses, it's the x. So I'm putting a 2 in the x spot of the coordinate. So what that means is I need to find 2 on the x. Here's 2. I need to climb to the line. There's the spot where 2 was. And then I see which y value it was. So in this equation, when the x value is 2, the y value is 3. Easy. Let's try that again. This time it says f of negative 2, so my x is negative 2. When my x value is negative 2, I climb to the line. There it is. That y value is 1. Last but not least, when x is a 0, I plug in a 0 for that ordered pair. X is 0 is right here. I climb to the line. Oh, right there. So when x is 0, the y is a 2. Very, very easy. So you're just finding the x spot, climbing to the line, and seeing what y number is there. Then you could always check it. 2, 3. Let's see. 2, 3. Yep, that's on there. Negative 2, positive 1. Yep, that's there. 0, 2, yep, that's there. Very easy. Okay, so go ahead and try these next two examples. So if it's in the parentheses, it's the x. Plug it in for x. When x is 4, climb to the line. Its y value is a 2. So easy. So when you have finished all 6 of those, we're going to flip to the very last piece of this lesson, which is actually even easier than the things that you were doing before. So in this last piece, this is the last part of this chapter. Next class, you do your test review, then you have your test, and then we move on to graphing and lines. So the last piece of this domain and range chapter is the easiest. So again, f of x is a fancy way of saying y equals. It says find the range, find the y values, if we know that the domain is a 2, a 3, and a 4. Well, what we know is that domain is the x. Domain is x, which means that these numbers are my x values. So one at a time, I'm going to plug it in for x. So in the first one, it says -3. Instead of x, I'm going to plug in my first x value, plus 1. -3 times 2 is -6, plus 1 is -5. Okay, first number is done. Next, I write my equation, I write my function. It's a -3. Instead of x, my x value is a 3. Then it says plus 1. -3 times 3 is -9. -9 plus 1 is -8. What that means is that when the x is 3 on this graph, its y value is going to be a -8. So this one is done. Last but not least, we take this 4, we plug it in for domain, which is x. So I write it down, -3. Instead of x, x is 4. And then it says plus 1. -3 times 4 is -12. -12 plus 1 is -11. So what this means is that when my domain, my x's were these numbers, my range are the numbers -5, -8, and -11. Not hard at all. Take your x's, plug it in for x, get your answer. We'll do one more together, and then I will let you finish the rest on your own. It's the same every time. So it says find the range, find the y values, given that these are your x values. So I write my equation, 2. Instead of x, x is a -1, -8. Took my first x value, and I plug it in for x. My first domain is x. So this is 2 times -1 is -2. -2 minus 8 is -10. Next, so this one is done. My next x value, take your equation, 2. Instead of x, plug in a 0. -8. 2 times 0 is 0. 0 minus 8 is a -8. If you struggle with integers, double check it in the calculator to make sure you are calculating these easy questions correctly. This domain number is done. Next, write the same thing, 2. That was for my function. Instead of x, my next x number is a 1, -8. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 minus 8 is -6. Done. Very pretty. Last but not least, my last domain number, my last x value, 2. Instead of x, x is 2. -8. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 minus 8 is the number -4. Voila. We plugged in all these x's. We plugged in all the domains. and out came our range. Okay, we plugged in all of our x's, and we ended up with all of our y values. So my answer is that my range, my y values on this graph would include the numbers -10, -8, -6, -4, fancy squiggly line. So when these were the x's they asked for, these are the y's that would be the output. Okay, next one, even easier. This is just a 5 times an x. So take each of these x's, plug it in. And then there's one more page of practice. Oops. So try each of these. They're giving you your domain, and you are plugging it in to find your range. Very, very easy. Again, your test is the end of this week. So next class, you are just reviewing everything we've talked about: functions, domain, range, discrete, continuous, and now evaluating from function notation. The purpose of today was to evaluate, to get numbers using function notation.